My name's Sam Ori. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute here at the University of Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this installment of EPIC's Energy Inquiry and Impact Series, the Fracking Debate, the pros, the cons, and the lessons learned from the U.S. energy boom. These are, I think, truly unique events. They're designed to explore the latest research coming out of EPIC faculty, cutting-edge academic research, but to explicitly also connect those insights to real-world policy and political discussions and debates. And we do this by putting together all-star panels like the one that we have here tonight. Joining us are EPIC's inaugural visiting fellows in policy practice, Sue Tierney and Jeff Holmstead. Sue is a highly regarded expert on energy economics and policy. She served as Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Energy under President Bill Clinton, a State Cabinet Officer for Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts, a Massachusetts Public Utilities Commissioner, and is currently a Senior Advisor at the Analysis Group. Jeff is a partner at the law firm Bracewell LLP, where he heads the firm's Environmental Strategies Group. He, during the George W. Bush administration, served as Assistant Administrator of EPA for air quality and radiation, and before that served as Associate Counsel in the George H.W. Bush administration in the White House. Moderating our discussion is Amy Harder. Amy covers energy and climate for Axios, and she writes a weekly column there called The Harder Line, which is a must read. And she previously wrote for the Wall Street Journal and National Journal. And starting us off with a short overview of the research that's really going to serve as our launching off point tonight is EPIC Director Michael Greenstone. And I'll just say, in addition to his many titles here at the university and all that he does here, prior to joining the University of Chicago faculty, Michael served for a year as the chief economist in the Obama White House. So we have quite a mix of policy and political experience here, and so looking forward to an excellent discussion. So please join me in welcoming everybody, and I'll turn it over to Michael to get us started.
Thanks very much, Sam. And when we were thinking about how to arrange this, of course, my first thought was, well, we should get some graphs. And there's so much beauty and truth in graphs, and I think these in particular help make the point. So about fracking. So in particular, people often refer to fracking, which maybe Amy's going to ask us where the name came from, as the most important change in the energy system maybe in the last half century. And so why is that? And so you can see there's several ways to depict it. Here, if you just focus for a second on the yellow line, you can see the production of tight oil or oil derived from shale rock has increased dramatically. And so it's the truth through 2016, and then it's after that it's a forecast. But what you can also see from the other lines that are forecasts is every time they forecast it, they're getting the error. They're getting it wrong, but they're only getting it wrong in one direction, which is they're underestimating how much we can get out of the rocks, out of the shale formations. And that's true for tight oil. It's also true for natural gas, as the second graph shows. So what has all that abundance, the era of energy abundance, produced? It's produced sharply lower energy prices. Everyone has benefited from that. It wasn't long ago that a realistic and central part of many energy policy plans centered in the United States centered around the notion of energy security. I think that's basically gone. We don't talk about that anymore. I think that was at the center of Sarah Palin's famous "Drill Baby Drill" chant in the middle of the RNC convention, was that we should drill to have energy independence, but we don't have to worry about that anymore. There's plenty of energy independence. It has also greatly reduced CO2 emissions from the U.S. power sector. I think there could be a reasonable discussion about what the long-run consequences of that are, but it has knocked, the natural gas has knocked coal out of the energy system. So that's produced lower CO2 emissions from the U.S. power sector, and has also been a great contributor to increasing air quality, and that has provided benefits for United States citizens as well. So kind of at a macro level, there's lots, or at a country level, there's lots and lots of benefits associated with it. And I think one of the themes we're going to talk about is that we're only going to be able to access those benefits, and this is true in the United States, it's true in North America, and will be increasingly true around the world, to the extent that the local communities that sit on top of the shale formations allow it. And the picture is possibly more nuanced when one just focuses on what the impacts are for local communities. But before we dive into that, it's just worth noting, which I kind of implied a moment ago, that these shale resources, which have led to this era of energy abundance in the United States, are not just in the United States. There's shale deposits all over the world. And you can see, at least with respect to oil, the United States might have the largest, but Russia is not far behind, and many other countries have very large, believed to have large shale oil deposits. And those are, to this point, kind of untapped. And I think so I'll leave it at that for the moment. In the case of shale gas, there's several countries who have much more in terms of resources. The current U.S. Department of Energy estimates are that there's about 100, that the shale revolution has unleashed about 120 years of global gas consumption at current levels. It just kind of, you can think of it as fell out of the sky almost. It's not that people didn't understand those fossil fuels were in the shale rock, they just didn't think they were available economically. So just to give you a sense, another feature of the shale revolution that I think is a change from the way energy production has taken place in the United States is that it's all over. It's not everywhere, but there's at least 9 separately identifiable shale regions in the United States. It's not just in Louisiana, it's not just in Texas, but it's in many parts of the country. One of the excellent panelists today is her house resides on top of a shale deposit. She has not yet, and she found out she owns the mineral rights. She has not yet taken advantage of that, but
will not.
In principle, she could, or someone who buys them could someday. So what have been the impacts for local communities? As I said, we're only going to access this if local communities allow it. What have been the impacts? Well, there have been really, and this comes from some of my research with Alex Bardick, Janet Curry, and Chris Knittel. There have been quite dramatic improvements in local economies. It is not in all cases, but in many cases they happen to be located in communities that were not doing very well economically. And here you can see average annual household income is up by about 7%. In the places that have allowed hydraulic fracturing to take place in a few short years after initiation. Total employment is up by about 10% in those communities. And if all of you had the patience, which Sam has assured me is not a reasonable assumption, I could walk you through the details of a gory economical model that would at the back end say that the average household in a shale community is willing to pay about $2,000 per year in terms of the benefits they're receiving are about equal to $2,000 per year per household in communities that have allowed shale. Now, so that's a paper that I wrote with Alex, Chris, and Janet. But one question that we had is there's been a lot of contention that, and I think the drilling companies have probably not helped by not always being completely transparent about what's in the fracking fluids, about that perhaps there's some health effects. And so everything that I've been showing you is like based on whatever people assume is true about health effects. And so what we tried to do was uncover it actually with data and move past kind of people's guesses. And that was in a separate paper with Janet Curry and Catherine Meckel. And there we found that the initiation of hydraulic fracturing led to an increase in the probability that infants were born at low birth weight, so that's below 2,500 grams. The three ranges there are showing you the effects at between 0 and 1 kilometers, 1 to 2 kilometers, and 2 to 3 kilometers. And so the largest effect is in 0 to 1 kilometer. It increases the probability of a low birth weight birth by about 25%. So it goes from about 6.5% to almost, around 8%. And there are effects also at 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And what's noteworthy, though, this is all data from, this is using data from the state of Pennsylvania. What's noteworthy is that there's no effect detectable after 3 kilometers. So that's about 2 miles. And so what we were able to find are health effects that are highly localized, but do appear to be real. Whether or not it shows up in other forms of health, cancer or long-run effects, could not be detected, or we didn't have the data to measure that, but I think this probably opens the door to further investigation. So none of this is to say that the costs outweigh the benefits. I think ultimately that's going to be up to local communities to decide, but I think it helps underscore that there are both costs and benefits. And as just the final slide here is meant to illustrate that basically all of the activity in accessing shale deposits has so far been in the United States. And so these results on what happens to local communities, I think, are particularly salient in areas in the United States that have not yet taken advantage of shale deposits. Some states have bans, New York State has banned, but also in the rest of the world. And you can see all those reserves that I showed you a few minutes ago basically are untapped at this point. And communities are going to be deciding in the years ahead. So that's meant to be background, and now I think Amy's going to lead us through a discussion without figures. Yes?
Correct.
Okay.
Figures.
All right.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that great presentation. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, thank you very much for having me here. It's great to get out of Washington and get to Chicago. And so we will be discussing up here for the next little bit, and then I'll throw it out to questions here in the audience. So please be thinking of questions that you'd like to ask. And for those on the live stream, thanks so much for joining us as well. Please take part in the conversation on Twitter at #EpicEvent, so EPIC event. And with that, I want to do a decidedly non-graphical question, which is the term fracking. Now, there's a lot in a name, and there's a lot in that term fracking. I wrote a lot of stories that had the headline, "Big Fracking Problem." And it was just so catchy as a reporter. That's ultimately what my editors ended up doing. So to each of you, I mean, can you talk about how much is in the term fracking in terms of how much is caught on? Because isn't it what we're really talking about, an increase in oil and gas drilling combined with fracking and horizontal drilling? It seems like fracking has taken on this greater than life role in this debate about fossil fuels and climate change. Michael, do you want to start on that?
So I will say this, and I'm going to really leave the real answer to the experts here, but my friends in the oil and gas industry insist that I spell Fracking to kind of avoid your headline. But of course, my friends in the environmental community insisted it be spelled Fracking. That's what I'll add.
And I noticed in your report that you actually use the term hydraulic fracturing.
Yes.
And that's really what the industry prefers,
Yeah.
even over the C less K framing. It's just too irresistible for opponents to not say no fracking way, because it just works, and it's pretty harsh sound. So it's loaded.
Jeff, what do you prefer?
So as you know, our firm has a strategic communications shop. And I can assure you they were not involved in labeling this technology. You know, the industry does try to use hydraulic fracturing, which isn't itself such a great sounding word, but it's really been impossible, in part just because of the difficulty of using this sort of the cumbersome word. So I think as someone who supports the technology, would be well advised to try to introduce a catchy term that doesn't sound quite so.
No fracking way.
Right, well, I think the ship has sailed on that.
Yeah.
I do actually want to bring the audience in. I have a couple of questions for you all, and they're very easy, and there's no wrong answer. But it's good to kind of get a sense of the room. So raise your hand if you generally support fracking. Raise your hand if you generally oppose fracking. And then raise your hand if you're unsure or neutral. Okay, great. I think we have a pretty good mix.
Yeah.
Which is, I one time moderated debate on fracking at NYU, and everybody's hand went up to say that they opposed it. Of course, New York has banned fracking. So, Michael, a question about your reports. What was the most surprising finding in each of them?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the local economic impacts, I thought it was going to be big, and that didn't seem like that was that surprising. But it was, the impact was bigger than I thought it was going to be. I mean, the idea that households equate allowing fracking with getting a check for $2,000 per year, every year, that's, I think it's, that's a big deal. And so I guess that surprised me, the magnitude on the upside surprised me. Again, that's with whatever households' perceptions were of what the health effects are. And then in terms of the infant health effects, I think what I was surprised by is how quickly they disappear in terms of distance from the well. And I think when you read the news media, can't you call it, the fluids are probably getting the water one way or another, and that's going to just affect people in a big radius. And it's just not in the data. And so there do appear to be real compromises in infant health, but it's in a pretty narrow range around the site.
And is that due to air quality issues or water quality?
Yeah,
or?
so no, it's I would say an unsatisfying feature of the study that we don't have a decisive answer on that. To my eye, it looks like it must be the trucks and the diesel generators and local air pollution right around the well site, but I'll confess that we don't have a decisive answer for that.
Jeff, I want to turn to you and get your response to, in particular, the health impacts study. So now, Jeff, for those of you who aren't sure, and as we stated before, Jeff worked in the George W. Bush administration. He was a top official at the EPA, and now he works at a law firm that represents, among many other clients, oil and natural gas producers. So what's your response to this in terms of the health impact, and what type of response from a policy perspective do you think there needs to be, if any?
So I have to say, I was a bit surprised that the magnitude of the health effect was ascertainable from the data. It obviously raises a number of questions that you showed on your graph. I mean, for one thing, why is the effect apparently less in 1 to 2 kilometers than in one? I mean, those are just kind of obvious questions.
No, come on, let's not do that. That's
No.
No. So hold on. This is like a red herring argument. The 0 to 1 versus 1 to 2, they're statistically identical. So that's like getting the magnifying glass all the way against the page.
And are they identical from 0 to 3 too, or?
Here's what I could say. They're statistically different from 0 at 0 to 1 versus further, 1 to 2 versus further, 2 to 3 further. But the idea of like the small dip between 1 to 2 relative to 0 to 1 is it's meant to cast shade. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but there are people who I think have done that, and it ignores that there is statistical imprecision.
No,
and I know
so
that that's not what you're doing, but
but
you can see that I've heard it a lot. So
But let me make another.
So I want to just stomp that out right away.
Well, here's the point I think.
And I'm right between these guys.
That's right.
Here's the point I think you will agree with, is that to the extent that these are real effects, we need to understand what they are. And again, as someone who's worked in this field for a long time, I agree with Michael that I would expect that it has something to do with air pollution. I mean, that's
As
where
opposed to water quality.
Well, yeah, but we've seen that politically, water quality is a much more potent issue. And it's just interesting, to me at least, that I think one of the things that is the subject for hopefully follow-up research is to understand really what is responsible for these.
I think
projects.
that's
And it
very
may not be
important.
possible
I think
to
that's
do.
very important, and I think what Jeff has in mind is, now I'm going to play the anti-academic role here and say, for some idealized world where we had perfect information, we could fine-tune the regulation just to hit the part of it that was causing the problem, and that should definitely be our goal. But I think there's scores of pathways. Even if it were the air pollution or the water and we could isolate that, there's like thousands of chemicals that go in the fracking fluid. So like, I don't hold great hope that we're going to have very decisive evidence on the exact channel. But I think what we do know is that there are health effects in small distances. Whether that means there should be compensation for people who live in those small distances, or there just should be an information campaign.
Or setbacks, or who knows?
Yeah, like those are all, I don't have a dog in the fight as to which way you go with any of those, but I think holding out that holding in abeyance the idea that there should be regulation until the last scientific thing, which, by the way, I would love to solve, is settled, I think is not the right thing.
So I agree with that. And especially if the cost of regulating is relatively modest compared to other things, right? I mean, and my impression is, at least from the industry perspective, most operators believe that they're better off with sort of reasonable regulations. And I think over time we have seen more responsible development of shale resources.
I do want to get back to the regulation question in a moment, but Sue, I want to go to you. And so as Michael just said, one of the things that surprised him most was the economic benefits of fracking and horizontal drilling. What's, you as a former Democratic official in the Clinton administration and sort of are, aside from Michael, who of course worked in the Obama administration, sort of the token left-leaning person on the panel. Can you talk?
So let the record reflect it's 2 against 1.
No, I'm the academic here.
Right, and I'm the referee. So although I will say that, it's funny because I find that in Washington everybody disagrees, and in conferences and panels like this, most people all agree. So it's actually nice that there's a variety of opinions here.
You haven't seen Sue and me before then,
I have. We were on a panel once in Washington.
We were,
at the King
exactly.
Conference, and it was
That was fun.
Right, it was. But so on the economic benefits, what's your response to that? And how do you engage in constructive dialogue with environmental groups and others many of whom are like anti-fracking, ban fracking? How do you bridge that divide?
How do I bridge that divide? I'm not sure I do, but a couple of things in response to that rich question. One of them is, I don't think that the environmental community is homogeneous on this issue. There are the water quality environmental folks. There are the carbon and methane environmental advocates. And then you could go on and on. There are local community concerns about just kind of the hazards of living, which I thought you did a great job of talking about in your paper, of the trucks, just a lot of wear and tear on communities. So I personally come down, and I know you didn't say this, Amy, but I personally come down to saying there is no clear answer here on whether this is a fabulous thing or not a fabulous thing.
Do you think the economic benefits are a good thing?
Yes, and they are quite double-edged. So good things from a very large macro point of view. The consumer savings are just extraordinary. Yeah. In terms of the amount of money that is in consumers' pockets, businesses and residential consumers, associated with natural gas prices being so low, gasoline prices being so low, and electricity prices being so low as a result of that. But, and we saw, as Michael said, that the carbon emissions of gas shifting coal away from so much power generation, that's terrific from a carbon point of view. But natural gas prices are putting tremendous pressure on the number of existing nuclear plants that are in the eastern part of the United States. Every time one of those shuts down, That's carbon emissions going up because you're going to turn on more gas plants. And I could go on, but I won't. There are just very complicated local impacts, which I thought you did a great job of looking at, but that's really complicated macro ones. Natural gas, for example, is just really wonderful and helpful for integrating with renewable resources in ways that other kinds of generating technologies cannot. But renewables and natural gas folks see themselves as completely opposed to each other in terms of hurting market share. So it's just, unfortunately, very complicated.
I wanted
Can I make
Not
just
satisfying, but-
one observation about this?
Sure, yeah.
At least we're not in at least we're in a situation where there is arguably local benefits as well as local costs,
Yeah.
because the much more difficult question is, let's say that there's significant national benefits but significant local costs. How do you deal with the
I
distribution
was just
issues?
thinking about the same issue.
And
yeah.
that, you know,
What's an example of that? Like a coal plant? Would
No,
that-
you could, citing a,
Oh, all sorts of
citing a nuclear
infrastructure.
plant.
Siting of a gas pipeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to me, in some ways, the most interesting statistic, which you mentioned, is that effect on home prices is at least a decent surrogate on what people think of the
Yeah.
local impacts.
Yeah.
And the fact that on average home prices have increased by 6% or something, it suggests that people are aware, at least they're aware of the concerns that have been raised about health impacts, and yet
I
people
think
still are
Jeff's
willing to
point-
pay more.
Jeff's point's super important, which is that, so in my measure of how much would households willing to pay, maybe it's easier to talk about housing prices. The idea of why housing prices are so important is that in principle they should capture both all the benefits and all the costs. And so if you see them go up, that's saying that local communities say, yeah, well, maybe there are some negative health impacts, but they're outweighed by whatever the local economic benefits.
And compared to industrial facilities, right? I mean, that's so industrial facilities that arguably benefit a lot of people, impact on home prices is pretty significantly negative.
But the issue here, I don't want,
Yeah.
forgive me, Amy, the issue is
Right
that
now, it's 2-on-1 against Sue.
within a
Which
community,
does not make it a fair fight. We're going to lose.
the community of local citizens, for example, in a community where hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling is occurring, it is so heterogeneous in terms of which side of this fight you're on. And so the discussion of an effect of being net positive or net negative for the community, which I think you did a fabulous job of doing, just overlooks the fact that within these local communities, there are people who are just on each side of a third rail.
No, and that's absolutely true. And I think one thing that markets can help sort out is the people who don't like it are probably going to sell their house to people who don't care so much.
So that brings me to my first lightning round question, which means that you answer a quick yes or no, although I will allow you to potentially elaborate afterwards, although I reside the control to make that decision. Would you choose to live within a mile of a new fracking well? And I know this is something that Sue has actually potentially had to decide anyways, but Michael, would you choose to buy a home within a mile of a new well?
No.
No.
Yes, all other things being, I mean, it is kind of a silly question because there's so many other things that
You haven't kept to my rule, but you can elaborate. So yes or no? Yeah.
It wouldn't dissuade me.
Now, a fun fact is Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, actually sued because of a fracking well right next door to him. So everything is quite local.
Seriously?
So let's talk about, there are people who have to live near these wells, and they may or may not be getting financial benefits from it. What do you say to these people? Michael, I guess I'll start with you. I mean, if you went to somebody's house with your health impacts report and your economic impacts report in hand, how would you explain this to them when you yourself would choose not to? And perhaps perhaps the people living next to a well don't have the financial means to live somewhere else.
Yeah, so I won't answer your question, but
Which is his prerogative.
But I think what it probably opens the door to is that maybe there should be forms of compensation, not just, so obviously the guys who own the mineral rights are getting compensated, But maybe there should be compensation for people who live within a certain radius. I don't know exactly what the radius is, that don't have mineral rights. That would be one. So I'm not really answering your question, but that could be a solution to the important problem you're identifying.
Sue, have you been approached to have an oil and gas company produce the?
No, to be honest, I live in an area where for years ago, probably 20 years ago, they settled who was going to own the rights. And so, no, I have not. But I know tons of people who have in Weld County near Boulder and a variety of other places. I live in Colorado, and it's a huge issue where some of the communities are voting to say we want to put a moratorium in place because of concerns about not being able to address the issue. One of the problems I think that's occurred on this topic is the practice that occurred in the early periods of this shale gas revolution, where there was stealth entry into communities, so people didn't really know who was buying and selling things and for what purposes. And there are a lot of bad surprises as a result of that. So I think that is changing, but that put a lot of bad taste in a lot of people's mouth.
And also, raise your hand if you've seen or heard of the documentary Gasland. Well, so I was at CERAWeek, which is this big energy conference in Houston, where the governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, said on stage that he thinks that film was the sole reason why France banned fracking. And so can you talk about...
New York, I would
New
say,
York,
and New
right,
York.
Right. Can you talk about sort of the impact of sort of media, I guess myself included, but also activist media like Josh Fox, who made that film Gasland? I think there's a lot of inaccuracies in that film, but nonetheless it had a big impact. Can you talk about how, I guess, Jeff, I'll start with you. I think, how do you think the industry should better respond to claims like that, whether or not there's any grain of truth to them? Sometimes there are, and sometimes there's not.
Well, to me, one of the most interesting things about Michael's studies, Michael and co-authors, is the way they were presented in the press. Because depending on where you read, I mean, if you read the Grist article, which you helpfully provided, the coverage is completely different than you would get in other publications. And so no matter how good the study is, how well it's conducted, how well its conclusions are explained, activists on both sides of the issue will use, and that's just the way that it works. I do think Gasland has had a big impact, and I think industry has struggled, notwithstanding the exposés that have supposedly been done and the criticisms that have been made. It's a real challenge, and I think the oil and gas industry is realizing that it needs to worry not only about the legal issues and about the regulations, but they really are now.
Of course, it's been 8 years, so they've been a little slow.
So it may not, but they're now operating in a very different environment, and I think they're putting resources into strategic communications, and I think it's been a challenge. I do think it's been a challenge, but I think at least they are now putting resources in trying to figure out how to better explain what they do and to try to address some of the concerns that have been raised.
Sue, what kind of scrutiny or criticism do you have for the sort of the storyline that came out of films like Gasland? Of course, that wasn't the only one on fracking. Do you think it sort of politicized the issue unnecessarily?
It demonizes the issue in a way where you're only just talking about one particular issue and anecdotal evidence of things. I don't know if anybody recalls seeing a series in New York Times, I think it was by Ian Urbina, and it made me really mad because I think there are legitimate problems associated with local impacts, and I think there are tremendous benefits associated with this. I just think it's really complicated, and anytime you've got a narrative that is just picking and choosing pieces of it, then you're not at the University of Chicago, because they do a good job. But it's a real problem.
Strategic,
and it was surprising that the New York Times.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a pretty partisan set of
It
articles.
was, yeah.
Well, speaking of partisanship, I want to turn to Washington, D.C. Now, there's been an hourly barrage of headlines on everything from the Russia controversy to Scott Pruitt's ethical lapses. But, if you dig deep enough, you do find some policy, and that's what I like to focus on. But it seems like with a Republican in office, fracking has gone to the back burner of federal policy. Environmental groups don't have a sympathetic ear in the White House. I think they would have more if Hillary Clinton would have won. To what extent do you think anything, number one, should get done at the federal level in terms of government policy of fracking and oil and gas? And what do you think can be done? And those are, of course, two very different questions. Does anybody want to jump in?
Well, let me start by saying that I think that the evolution of governance over oil and gas drilling has occurred predominantly under state law. It is, there are constitutions in some states where you have to be able to develop the resource and do it in a way that balances with conservation and so forth. And those are in Oklahoma's an example where that's in their constitution. So there is such a body of states' rights on this, and that creates a very varied playground in terms of enforcement, the types of practices, and there's been a resistance, I think, of having more standardized practices across the states. So now to your question about federal, I do think that there are some things associated with air quality and associated with waters of the U.S. and other things. No, that was just a little sidebar joke. Where
I thought it was called the Clean Water Rule.
Yes, it is the Clean Water Rule. Where there are larger spillover effects on different communities, which I think could call for it. I don't think we're going to see anything happen in this next little while.
Jeff, what about you? Do you think there needs to be, the Trump administration is rolling back any regulations that Obama had done on fracking. I will say that a federal court actually rejected Obama's fracking rule at the Interior Department. So there's also been some court pushback. But Jeff, can you talk about to what degree there should be some sort of federal response to fracking? Because so far there hasn't been.
So I'm going to try to give a principled answer instead of a political answer.
Because we're at the University of Chicago.
We are. In general, when we talk about environmental law, where there are issues that really are entirely local issues, and there isn't cross-border implications, I think that should largely be left to the state or the local governments. And 40 years ago, there were legitimate arguments that states were just not capable of dealing with some of these issues, and that really is one of the reasons that we have the system that we do. But when it comes to oil and gas development, a lot of, it's not true that Texas doesn't care about these issues. They actually have regulators that know a lot about the industry, that are involved, and so I think a lot of it can be done there. I think there are certainly some cross-border issues where it is important for the government to step in. So that's, I think
what's an example of that?
Air quality in particular, where there are, transport of air pollution over longer areas, and in particular methane emissions, right?
So now methane.
That's not a local issue.
So methane, so methane is it's a potent greenhouse gas, and it's also the primary component of natural gas.
This is the
So it's a
University of
climate
Chicago.
impact.
Everybody knows those things.
Just raise your hand if you know what methane is. Okay, but I saw a few hands didn't go up.
But can I make just an observation? Within the industry, and this won't surprise some of us, there are companies that believe it's important to have federal regulation. They believe that they would be better off in terms of public perception if there is federal regulation of methane or of these other things. And you always worry about rent seeking and whether, but I think there are people who legitimately just believe that the industry is better off to be able to point to a federal regulation.
But they won't advocate for it.
But actually some are. But they're not going to be doing it publicly.
They don't
but I
tell
can
me, and I try to get them to tell me.
I sit in different meetings maybe than
Well,
you
tell
do.
them to call me.
I
So
always do.
can I just add one area where I think there would be an exciting opportunity for exploring policy that I'd be interested in my fellow panelists' views on is, in principle, it seems like one could explore having a carbon charge associated with the petroleum, the natural gas, or even the coal that you're pulling out of the ground. Certainly on federal land, and then I don't know what the legal issues for doing that would be on private land, but I think there's a strong case of, from an economics perspective, cross-border, international, of having a carbon charge associated with it.
Carbon and or methane charge.
Yes.
Or greenhouse
Okay,
gas
lightning
charge.
round. Good idea.
Jeff,
And
do you have
I think
any-
there was a little momentum at the end of the Obama administration towards that, but that has petered out.
Are you talking about a charge that would be associated both with the direct emissions and also the emissions that come from?
That are embedded in the
Yeah.
in the fuel source.
I mean, obviously, if you had that charge only on resources developed on federal land, you end up, skewing things in a way that probably isn't optimal. Look, from a policy perspective, I would bet everyone here would agree that if you're going to get serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, some sort of a fee or a tax is a very efficient, very effective way of doing it. I like to talk about things that are politically possible, and so I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the details on such things. I just don't think that's in the cards.
Although that would be a very small universe of things to talk about, it seems like, at the Washington level anyway. I once sat in on a graduate level class at Johns Hopkins Scythe School in Washington, and the subject was Fracking 101. And the professor said very confidently that states can't regulate fracking, so the federal government must. This was probably around 2012. So I found that a little interesting, and then I Googled him, and he's a lawyer at Earth Justice, an environmental group that is quite opposed to fracking. Because the federal government is not regulating fracking, I mean, do you think the states are up to the task? And what are you watching at the state level? In Colorado, of course, is ground zero, and in Pennsylvania and Oklahoma. Are there any particular states that you're watching on this issue?
Well, I'm a former state official in a very, very blue state, Massachusetts, and so
Where there's no fracking or resource.
Wait, there's no resource. I love it. There
there
were
wouldn't be
bills
fracking.
No, but it's not
introduced
just
into
that
Massachusetts.
they don't want the cheap natural gas.
Yeah, the
Well,
They don't want to
but
consume
there are
it. They don't
electricity
want.
Exactly. No fracked gas sold in Massachusetts.
But their electricity bills are high, aren't they?
Yeah.
Sure, but they're lower now because of natural gas. So what I was about to say is I observe that in a number of states where there are either elected or appointed officials in very hydrocarbon-rich states, that their enforcement policies and other things are not what I would have considered to be up to snuff in where I was head of environmental issues in a state. So that's pretty controversial to say that, and it has to do with the resources and the attitudes, of course, of what you're doing in the constituency. I'll give an example again of Oklahoma, and I think it's an interesting case for a couple of reasons. I am not saying they're not enforcing things, but watching what has happened there with the earthquake activity, I have observed the state officials who were extremely gung-ho and saying that we've got it all under control, there is no problem, and I'm talking about also from a 2010, 2012 period. There's now a recognition that there are some things they didn't think were going to be happening. So there is a movement, it's been reactive, but there's progress being made. But I do worry about enforcement questions.
And that's part of the problem. I mean, a lot of this stuff takes time. I mean, to get the impacts of the health, you can't do it the year after, right? I mean, and fracking seems to be out of the top tier headlines, but it's still very much a local issue.
Yeah, no, just getting the data to do that study in Pennsylvania basically, Pennsylvania had a long history of oil and gas production, but
Yeah.
that was basically dead. And so there was like a guy, and so we were calling the guy, and could, he share the records with us, and he's like, yeah, I would love to, but there's like a bazillion wells being drilled right now, and this is on my list, but it takes a long. I think a lot of the states were, this was like a tidal wave, and I think a lot of states were not ready.
Well, Pennsylvania is a good example of where they did gear up much faster than some other places.
They did some others, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it certainly has not been my experience that state officials are not developing or enforcing, right? I mean, the other thing I will say is, again, this may be self-serving, but for the clients that we work with, they take compliance very seriously. It's not as though the only reason they comply is because there's the threat of litigation. I mean, it's part of, they have responsibilities to shareholders, to the community. So I do think that there is effective regulation for the most part. The thing that I think, though, is interesting is how different states are. You have some states, like, let's say, Colorado, where this, at the state level, the state is relatively supportive of fracking and has preempted all these. So you have the state essentially saying, we are going to have development in this state, even though you have some local communities that don't want development nearby. And then you have New York, where polling data suggests that the areas where there's a lot of potential, you've had enormous local support. And the parts of the state that are not going to be, that are not going to have any activity are the parts of the state that basically control the state house and prevent it from happening. So you really have examples of both ways, where local communities would like it, where the state will let them do it, and other times where the local communities would like to keep it out, and the state is saying, no, we'll set the rules here.
One of the things that Jeff has just said, I think, is something I want to follow up on, and that's with regard to the body of companies that are involved in this. They are also not homogeneous, as you know. There are some very large corporations who have been in this business for a really long time and are very clear that they want to comply and they want everybody else to comply. And then there's a tail end effect of the others who could bring down the license to operate in some communities because of it.
Jeff, we were talking about that a little bit in the context of methane regulation at the federal level. Now, can you talk a little bit more about how you're seeing that play out, and what do you think will be the ultimate impact of this sort of division within the industry? I mean, do you think, the EPA and the Interior Department both have separate regulations on methane emissions? Do you think one of those will remain in some form at the end of the Trump administration?
Yes, I think there will still be some federal regulation of methane, both at EPA and at Interior. I think it won't look like it looks today. But unfortunately, I think the next time there's a Democratic administration, you will see a big change. And again, I think most of my clients would much prefer a sort of in the middle course. I mean, the
they should
idea
go on
that
the
we
record with me and say that, because they don't.
But think about Interior is a principally Western United States purveyor of public lands, and their jurisdiction is over drilling and production on public lands. Most of the resources are on private lands on the eastern side of the United States, and that is where EPA would have more regulatory jurisdiction that matters for air and water issues. So it's really...
EPA has jurisdiction over the whole country.
Well, that's true. They are
not limited to the eastern United States.
Until... No, yes, I was going to make a joke, but I won't.
Making jokes about EPA can be a fraught effort these days.
Yeah, but at point of fact, can EPA set the rules for drilling on federal land?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
See, look at that. We're confirming.
We're in agreement.
Here on stage. I want to do another lightning round question related to climate change. Do you think natural gas, in particular, is a net benefit for addressing climate change or a net negative? Michael, you haven't spoke for a couple minutes. You can go.
Well, so climate change is a long-run problem. It's not a today or tomorrow problem. I'm going to answer a slightly different question. Do I think the hydraulic fracturing revolution and its discovery of natural gas is a net benefit or net negative? It's a net negative.
Sue, I'm not sure how that differs from my question.
No,
It
I was
sounds
just
longer.
I was just trying to separate. All right, sorry. It's a negative.
Negative. Sue?
So I think from a very short-term point of view, it is net positive, at least in the United States and in some other places where it is moving coal out of the market share. In the long run, it is a net negative, in my opinion.
Jeff?
I don't agree with that, and I don't think we have enough.
You don't
So-
agree
so-
with what exactly?
I don't agree that fracturing is a net negative.
So do you think it's a net positive?
Oh, certainly in the near term, we would all agree it most certainly is. And not only.
Except climate change is an inherently long-term
Yeah.
Yeah,
problem.
but a ton of CO2 that goes into the air today is going to have an effect for 100 years. So if you eliminate it today, no matter what discount rate you use, that has a pretty important impact. So again, it depends entirely on a lot of these concepts, but under traditional analysis, reducing a ton of.
But the supply. The way I'm interpreting Amy's important question is. Let's just drop all the words. Did the supply of very inexpensive fossil fuels increase due to hydraulic fracturing? And I think the answer is yes. It's a resounding yes. And so, like in any long-run vision of like now we have a ton more of this stuff and it's super cheap, are we just going to let it sit there?
Okay, but how much coal do we have in the world today? And what's the cost of coal relative to natural gas? If you could displace what percentage of the coal with natural gas, what would it be? The other thing that we haven't talked about a whole lot, although you mentioned it, is the introduction of renewables would be much more costly and much more difficult if we didn't have natural gas as a way to provide a backup. I mean, managing the grid with a lot of renewables and no natural gas would be.
That's why I said in the short
No.
term.
Well, and who knows how long that short term is going to be.
And
so
without a price on carbon, we're going to be really behind the eight ball.
I mean, the essence of your question, of course, is natural gas the blue bridge to the green future, or is it just a really, really, really long blue bridge?
Now, the Sierra Club launched in 2010 its Beyond Natural Gas campaign, where it fights building new natural gas plants. And Michael Brune, the executive director of the club, told me at the time that they were doing that because the International Energy Agency just released a report where one of its authors said the report was called The Golden Age of Gas, all about the shale natural gas revolution. And the head of the IEA said at the time, we're calling this a golden age of gas, not the golden age for climate. So can we dig a little bit more into sort of the double-edged sword that it appears natural gas is for climate change? Maybe Sue, I'll go to you and talk about the benefits of balancing it with renewables. I mean, how do you engage on this discussion with, other like-minded, progressive people?
Like me.
So like my friend here, I completely agree that in the short run, and I would say short run in this context is not 2 weeks, it's many years, but not 50 years. And in the absence of really great storage of a variety of different types of technologies, you cannot integrate renewables without natural gas. So I do think that's really important. So do I think that's then great in terms of building all sorts of new gas pipelines to deliver stuff out of Marcellus and enable us to have tap into this resource? No, I think that's a problem because in the long term, we are going to be in a situation where we have to reduce our carbon emissions so dramatically that I think there's problems of stranded costs. There are all sorts of issues that if you can figure out how to have a different discount rate to address some of those long-lived capital assets that people want to put in place today because of the wonder of shale gas, I think we are, what did you say, the bridge to?
The long, long blue bridge.
The long, long blue bridge is pretty scary.
Can I add something? One thing we should keep in mind, so first of all, I'll say I think natural gas is like if you're sitting in India or China, it's like the deal of the century. And they, in addition to wanting cheap energy, they do, I'm sure they care about climate, but like what they're really suffering from is they can't breathe very well with the air pollution, and it's greatly shortening lives there. And I think a global market for natural gas will develop. All those bars of all the countries that have reserves of natural gas, those guys are not going to leave that stuff sitting there forever. And it's going to start flowing around the planet, and it'll certainly flow to those two countries. And that's part of my vision of the long blue bridge. Is it's going to look like a great deal to them.
And do you think that long blue bridge to places like India is good for climate change?
No, I think it's going to be very good for them for air pollution, and
Right,
very
because, of
good
course,
for longer health for them.
Embedded in your statement, of course, is that natural gas has very little traditional pollutants compared to coal.
Yes.
Which I think is overlooked in this.
But again, given the data on the mortality caused by elevated levels of PM 2.5,
Which comes from coal plants.
and the hundreds of
Jeff
thousands
has
of
been reading
lives
Epic research again.
that would be saved by switching from.
No, but
So,
Amy,
so how do you compare that with the, with the long horizon of climate change? How many lives are you willing to sacrifice over the next 20 years because you want to make it more expensive for people to use?
So
fossil
Amy was
fuels?
asking about climate change, so narrowly. I think what you're asking
Although
is,
I think we can broaden it.
yeah, you're asking what we like to talk about here is like the global energy challenge. How do you balance the need for inexpensive and reliable sources of energy that are critical for growth with concerns about air pollution and health, and with concerns about climate? And I think the short answer is there's no single button you can push that's going to make all three of those things move in the right direction at once. And it's going to inevitably involve trade-offs, and the problem's going to look so much different in India than it does sitting here today, where we don't really have first-order air pollution problems.
So Cheniere Energy, which is one of the largest liquefied natural gas companies, and Tellurian, which is a new company that also exports natural gas. The founder of both of those companies, Sharif Suku, I spoke with him earlier this year, or actually last year, and he told me that he supports a price on carbon emissions. And he said he thinks it should be around $40 a ton. And he doesn't support a carbon tax for altruistic reasons. No private company or any company really does, but he supports it because natural gas is, and the experts here can offer their thoughts on this, because natural gas is poised to benefit up into a certain carbon price. And Tellurian is also, its CEO told me that it's looking to expand in non-natural gas industry and technologies in 20, 30 years' time. Can you talk about how even a carbon tax would actually help increase the demand for natural gas?
I believe that that's the case, depending upon the price, of course, but thinking in a lot of these different markets, that's where things would go.
And do you think that's how it should go? Because
So you support a carbon tax, but you oppose long-term use of natural gas. So how do you strike the right balance there?
Well, when we start getting that carbon tax and carbon pricing thing, that will affect the long-term role of natural gas, in my opinion.
And by long term, you mean like post 2050, when most of us
Post any time in
retired.
which you start pricing carbon and then ratcheting it up close to the cost of carbon.
Can I make, Michael has heard me make this point before,
But I'm sure some of us haven't.
and he always agrees with me. There are many parts of the world still, as Epic well knows, that have enormous poverty
Absolutely.
that could be alleviated by a supply of energy. And in most of the world today, in most of the world, the cheapest way to provide that energy is with coal. And
the
given
cheapest, not counting
Michael
health.
agrees
no,
with that?
understood.
Right.
No,
No,
he
not
would-
counting. No,
purely-
that's just the
purely-
private cost of production.
The
just the
monetary
private
cost.
forgetting about the externalities.
Yeah.
And
There's no debate about that. Yeah.
but my point is, as long as that's the case, unless you somehow think that renewables are going to provide the kind of reliable, affordable electricity that people want, I don't know. I think it's very hard to oppose the use of natural gas because.
No, but I don't. So let's just find a little common ground. I don't think any. I think talking about particular technologies is or fuel sources that would not be my preferred way to go. I think we should figure out how large the externalities are, so how big the climate damages are, and then since.
So you support the social cost of carbon.
It's application. Yes, I do. It's application.
And I agree.
And then, but you can do the same thing for the health effects.
Absolutely.
And then let the chips fall.
Let it happen.
But if you could,
See, you all agree. I have one more question.
If you could price all those externalities, my sense is you would end up encouraging the use of natural gas for quite a while into the future.
So that's fine.
I agree
until
with
we're
that.
all retired and
Yeah.
it's not our problem anymore.
Oh, but that'll be some of us sooner than the others.
I have one more question from me, and then I'm going to throw it out to you all, so please have your questions ready. There's been a growing trend among some of the largest oil and gas companies to clamp down more on methane emissions and even invest more in renewable energy. The American Petroleum Institute issued a voluntary guidelines on this issue. Do you think this is serious efforts? Do you think these represent serious efforts, or do you think it's more just greenwashing and posturing in the face of an administration that is doing very little on the issue? Jeff, why
So
don't you go?
I represent a lot of energy companies, and my experience has been that they take those things very seriously. It's not as though they put anything out there and say, well, API should do this because it's good for our image. There's debate and discussion over all the details of those things, and so I do think that those types of policies, for the vast majority, and there are bad actors out there, and there are people who may not be bad actors but are not so good actors, but for the majority of the production that's out there, I think people take them very seriously.
Yeah, I don't see that as greenwashing, because I think with the communities that they would be greenwashing to, it doesn't work in any event. So I agree with you that I think these are serious efforts. Some companies realize that they may want to diversify, but other companies may really decide that their business model is only hydrocarbons.
Great. Well, I want to throw it out to you in the audience. We have a couple of microphones going around, so please raise your hand. And right here in the...
Hello, my name is Tom Wolf. I work for a small oil and gas company called BP America. Thanks for having me here. We are a company, by the way, a private company that is advocating for a national price on carbon, through a carbon tax preferably, but the discussion will go on for a while. A question for the panel and a question for you, Amy. This has been a great panel. This is a very complicated issue, has a lot of, whack-a-mole. You hit something here, it comes up there, and I appreciate you guys knowing that. There was a presidential candidate in 2016 that talked about banning fracking. That was one of his applause lines. Senator Bernie Sanders talked about that a lot. So if you were talking to Senator Sanders and were giving him advice on his 2020 campaign, if he runs, would you suggest that it's a good idea or a bad idea to ban fracking? And for Amy, for all the presidential candidates that I watched throughout that campaign, whether it was Trump with the wall or emails with Hillary, there was a lot of pushback from the media about what the reality checks were on that. I did not see that on Bernie Sanders' call for a ban on fracking. Not that it's a good idea or a bad idea, but not even a discussion of what the complications of that was. Do you think the media covered that well enough or could do better next time? Thank you.
So I was asked to present on energy issues to the Democratic National Committee, and I was asked that question. And I said that that would be a very bad idea to ban fracking, because that will mean coal will come roaring back. It's not as though if you ban fracking tomorrow that you are going to have a next step function of renewable energy in a way that could satisfy the nature of energy demand that we have. So I think it would be a terrible idea. And you can picture the reaction that I got. And I am left-leaning.
I can picture that.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Sue. I would not be in favor of banning fracking.
And Jeff, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you don't support a ban on fracking either.
I think that's fair to say.
Well, Tom, thank you for your question.
Oh, but you didn't answer the question.
No,
about
I
the
am
media
now.
as well.
I'm
Okay,
going.
good, good.
Oh, good. Yeah, haven't forgotten. I always hated when I ask anybody 2 questions. They never answer the second question. Men do that in particular, so I have to ask them in phases. But I'm not going to do that to you.
You know, that's because we're slower, dumber.
That's what I figured.
Right, yeah.
But I can really only speak for myself. I think generally speaking, the media can always do a better job. I think for me, it was more of in my position at the time during the election, I was at the Wall Street Journal, and I didn't really cover the campaign, and we had our political reporters covering it, and they didn't really focus on it, and I was focused on the 11th hour regulatory moves by Obama. So it just wasn't something that I prioritized, and that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's helpful because it's the truth, which I always strive for. So I think now, you know, in my new role where I have a little bit more freedom to write about what I want, I think I would definitely jump in and do a fact check on that, as I've done, you know, over the last year when Trump did things. So stay tuned. Another presidential election will come around. So. Do we have other questions up here? Right there, and so the gentleman there, and then the woman in red next.
There was a movie called that, wasn't there?
Thank you very much. I'm a MPP, a Master of Public Policy student at the Harris School. And over at the Harris School, we are very interested in state capacity and institutional checks and balances and how factors such as natural resource wealth and the sudden introduction of massive natural resource wealth can affect that. So the graphs, Michael, that your slideshow had at the very beginning showed just the sheer boom of natural resource wealth that is being introduced in local communities and states all over the country. I'd be very interested in hearing from you three how that is leading to maybe straight up graft and corruption, or changing the ways that officials and regulators are capturing short-term rents in a way that in the long term is bad for everybody.
You know, I think if you look internationally, maybe it's because the mineral rights are largely held by individuals, they're not owned by governments in the United States. The United States looks pretty good on that dimension. I think you can, everyone's got probably a favorite story of a particular regulator in a particular state, but when you look internationally, and again, a lot of it is the mineral rights reside with the land Sioux, that I don't think that's been a pervasive feature of the hydraulic fracturing experience in the U.S.
I'm struggling with your question because when I look across the map of the United States, I see resource disparities of enormous variation of attributes. I mean, we're talking about here minerals, but you can think of forests, you can think of water, and a variety of other things, and it's just not peanut buttered across anywhere. And so for better or for worse, there are these different endowments that are places, and it's hard to know what you do with that fact.
The only thing I would add is a related question that is at least as important is where you have states that have come to rely on a resource endowment at a certain price. When that price dramatically drops, what do they do? And we have the situation of Alaska in particular and others. And that obviously causes huge financial and political implications when that
That's with any resource dependent.
Oh, sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
The Dutch
Yeah.
disease, right? Isn't that what?
Yeah,
Yeah,
although
yeah,
I mean, I
right.
think again from a global perspective, Alaska's handled it
Well,
with like
right,
you know,
compared
A+.
to Venezuela.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, right.
Well, they hiked their gas tax.
Yeah.
The woman right here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Dr. Jessica Swanson. I'm a theoretical chemist here at University of Chicago. And I hate to throw out kind of an idealist question, but it seems like most of the discussion tonight, before the very end, and we start to talk about climate change, focused on the present and very immediate future pros and cons. And, you know, one would ideally hope that governance and policymakers are very forward-thinking. So why is it so challenging to focus on the pros and cons of 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when my children, my grandchildren are going to be facing these challenges. So I guess the question is, how would you change your description of the pros and cons if you had to be that forward-thinking? And not just about climate change, about the health consequences and the environmental consequences as well.
Oh, I think actually all of us were thinking about that when I think we agreed to price externalities, which really means put a price on what the climate damages would be and put a price on what the current health damages would be.
There's a huge...
And we might disagree on exactly what the price is, but I think that's what we all had in mind.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with what Michael said, and I've never run for office and never would, and would never be elected, probably. And the reason I put it that way is...
You might be the best candidate on this panel.
Maybe in Massachusetts.
Yeah. The incentives in our political system and communication systems are just completely misaligned with a long-term view, unfortunately. So I do think there are a lot of people thinking about how to talk about these issues in different ways that are powerful, in a social media context or anything else, and we have not solved that problem yet.
The only thing I would add is this question is hardly unique to the issue of climate change. I mean, you talk to people who really pay attention to the federal budget, and there's some pretty scary things that thoughtful would say about the entitlement programs. And we're not talking about a disaster 100 years from now. We're talking about something that's going to have serious consequences during our lifetimes. And yet the political system is just incapable of focusing on those because of the way the incentives are structured. Ask Paul Ryan, who made a career out of wanting to deal with entitlement reform, and ultimately has decided that
Wasn't going to happen.
Sayonara.
And so I wish I knew what the answer was, but it's hardly unique to this set of issues.
Do we have more questions? I think I've seen a few hands go up.
And there's one over there, too.
Oh, yeah, why don't we go behind? Thank you.
I
got
just
a-
didn't
got a
think that
blind
you could
spot,
see, that's
yeah.
all. Yeah,
I was
exactly.
relieved that that's the question we got from a theoretical economist. I was prepared.
Hi, everyone. I'm a JD student here at the University of Chicago's Law School. We're famous for law and econ, so I guess this is perhaps in that direction, at least, thinking about both like local governance and thinking about people's understanding of different information. I was curious about how you take into account maybe people not understanding certain impacts or not knowing about the research that you all are doing here at EPIC and potential health impacts and things like that, and how that might affect both these home prices. And we were talking about, well, there are some states that have allowed exploitation of natural gas resources where people locally in some areas don't want it, and vice versa. I'm wondering how you can incorporate that into some kind of sensible regulatory structure.
Yeah, I think so. A key role for governments is to make sure information is commonly shared and widely available. So that's.
And we're seeing that every day in Washington,
we're
right?
seeing that every day.
Go ahead, sorry.
But the way I did try to describe the paper on the total economic impact very carefully, and I think that has to be interpreted as being true up to whatever people understand, and. Now, I think there's a temptation to run to, well, did people think that there was zero health effects? I actually think when you see all those trucks going by and you hear the diesel generators, that probably the people who live there don't think that there were zero health effects. But what's certainly true is that as new information emerges, like my second paper on what the infant health effects are, it merits going back and looking if that changes the sense of like what happens to housing prices. Presumably because people now have new and better information for which they can update on. So anyway, that's my answer.
Great. A couple more questions. One in the back, and then great. Then you got the question.
Yes, I'm a regional coordinator for an advocacy organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which advocates for a national carbon tax. And I have a question for Dr. Greenstone in particular. Do you think is there a price for carbon at which we can avoid that long blue bridge that you talked about? And if so, what is it? And how do we get there?
Yes, I don't do that kind of economics to model that. But let me push back and say I don't think that's the right question. I don't think that we would want a price for, yes, there is a price. It's called $500 per ton. And,
Right.
but I don't think we would want that price. The price we want is the price that's set equal to what the damages from an extra ton of CO2 emissions are. So, it was an undercurrent here in a discussion. Like, the goal is not to stop fossil fuels. The goal is to have policy that manage it where the benefits are larger than the costs. And setting a price at $500 a ton or $1,000 a ton is going to be more costly than whatever the avoided climate damages are.
Well, and I would add to what you said, you described the policy as the benefits versus costs, but that prices to individual companies and people, in effect, also tell them the trade-off as well, which I know you meant to also say,
But I don't think the goal, and I think that's an important point, like, I do not think the goal is kill fossil fuels.
But is the goal to decarbonize the economy?
No, that's a fancy way of saying kill fossil fuels. I don't think that's the goal.
You could decarbonize with fossil fuel. You could do that if we made investments in certain technologies.
Right, although that may not be the most cost-effective way of doing it.
Especially without a price on carbon. So thanks for working on a price on carbon.
I think we have time for one or two more quick questions. I think we have one in the back with the microphone.
Hey, thanks so much. My name's Smith Johnson. I'm a Master of Liberal Arts student, so I really don't know very much. But I'm gonna.
Good. The methane explanation was for you.
No, thanks so much. It was really a high-level talk, very, very civil and good to hear. We talked a little about some of the local issues with fracking, and I'm a big fan of the 5th and 14th Amendment, and looking at property rights. And then we also talked a little bit about the macro level debate. And so my question has more to do with the macro level debate, and I apologize if it's a little out of scope of what we've been talking about in this context. But if we get rid of natural gas, let's say, on like a large macro scale, I mean, what do we expect to replace baseload, the baseload generation, especially considering that nuclear and coal plants are going offline? I'm curious about your thoughts about the technical and economic feasibility of having 100% renewables, for example.
That's such a great question. It could be a whole nother event. Sue, do you want to?
The reason I responded about decarbonizing the way I did is I think there are many technologies in a robust portfolio that are essential to keep as part of a mix. But I don't use the word baseload. I think baseload, you are very young, but that's an old-fashioned word. That's a word associated with something of yesterday's economics about certain types of technologies and plants. You could put together packages of equipment providing different functionalities and work well. And that's another topic for another conversation. And it's one of my favorites, so let's just do it.
Great, we have time for one more question. I don't know if somebody has the mic. Yep,
this person.
Great.
So maybe this is a question for Jeff, given your connections to oil and gas. I'm looking at a map of shale oil and gas plays in federal lands. Do you think your clients and the companies that you work with would be supportive of, say, a middle ground that says some federal regulation akin to SMACRA for oil and gas, or for tight oil and shale gas, plays on federal lands?
This may seem like the coward's way out, but I don't know. But I am troubled by the idea that you would certainly have a suboptimal investment of resources if you had significant regulation on federal land that wasn't available elsewhere. I mean, I think it would be, from an economic perspective, I don't think that's ideal. It's also tricky, and I've suggested I am in favor of some significant deference to local conditions, because my understanding is that the different plays have different characteristics and different regulations are needed. And as opposed to having something that just applies on federal lands versus non-federal lands, I think a system that was capable of dealing with those differences would be a much more effective way of doing it.
Can I just want to pick up on that, because I think if that was the end of all policy, that is exactly right. But if you think of policy as kind of a living, breathing animal, where we take one step forward and 2 steps back and 2 steps, like, that might not be a bad step forward. It would certainly introduce some economic inefficiencies as to where the production takes place on federal versus private lands. But, like, you know, all of California's policies were probably stupid if they were viewed as only trying to influence exactly what would happen in California. But a lot of times, you know, there's the states are the laboratory of democracy, and the same thing could be true for federal lands.
I can see a campaign ad ending right after you say all of Californian policies are stupid.
Yeah. That's going to be deleted.
I do want to ask one more lightning round question because we are out of time, so you have to keep it short. If you put yourself in the position of being the advisor of the next presidential candidate, whoever that may be, putting partisan politics aside, what would your advice be when it comes to fracking? What would you tell them in one sentence, him or her?
Fracking is a piece of a very complicated set of policies and technologies and institutional arrangements. It should not be wiped off the face of the earth. But there have to be a number of complementary policies to make sure that externalities are addressed.
Mike?
I would tell her to impose a carbon tax and some disclosure regulations for what's in the fracking fluids and get out of the way.
Your turn.
Even if I agreed with Michael, I probably would not give that advice to a political candidate.
I think there were some reports that Hillary Clinton actually looked at a carbon tax and opted not to, but I guess that's why you're more of an economist than a political advisor.
Well, also her husband proposed the BTU tax and he went down in flames.
Right. But Jeff, what would your advice be on fracking?
Remember, advice is different than choosing.
That's true. That's true.
Advice is different than?
I'm not saying the question could have been if I were Hillary Clinton or if I were Donald Trump, what would I have chosen given particular advice?
He's paying attention to my question.
You know,
remember, it's lightning round, so one sentence. Not a run-on, like what Sue did.
That's right. Multi-part, semicolon.
So I would say fracking is enormously important, but reasonable regulation is better than no regulation at all.
Great. Well, that's a good, succinct sentence. I want to thank the panelists and everybody joining us online and in the room. And for those of us here in Chicago, there is going to be a reception outside this room that we all hope you can join us at. So thank you so much. Nice job.